Nerd! Welcome to my tavern. How can I help? Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of A Day in the Tavern. Yes, that's right, you're joining me on another episode of me randomly spewing about geeky and nerdy stuff. However, before I jump into today's geek-tastic episode, allow me to talk to you guys a little bit about a little group called the Crit Takers. Which, if you don't know who the Crit Takers are, you're watching this video off our channel, for fuck's sake. The Crit Takers are mostly a bunch of musicians and two of our absolute wonderful friends playing Dungeons & Dragons every Monday evening. Obviously now, with the current pandemic going on and everything, and social distancing having to be put in place, we haven't been playing live or recording our sessions to post up on YouTube at the minute. But as soon as that's over, yeah, we're coming back live streams. We live streaming in the second we are able to, or the week we are able to. We coming at you live every Monday evening, roughly about 7:30 till probably 11 or something like that. Depends on what time we're kind of finishing and things like that. But that's not for now. So, I described this episode as being geek-tastic for a reason. Because this week I want to talk a little bit about where the words geek and nerd come from, and their basis and how they've changed, or the perception of them have changed over the years. Now, we dig back, say, maybe to the 70s and 80s, both these terms have massively different meanings than they do today, going back 50 years. Yeah, half a century. Half a century is a lot of time for something to change. And too right, it is the definition of what they are and what they mean to today's society has changed quite a bit. I'm not going to dispute that, I'm not going to challenge that. Oh, excuse me. And certainly nothing wrong with that. Now, for me, expression of both can be they're two very different words at the end of the day. I think this is what people can mistake a lot sometimes. And my head canon version of the definition of both is quite simple. Nerd is someone who's obsessive about computers, is very book smart and things like that, knows in a book kind of things, probably grown up to be some kind of computer technician or something like that. Geek is something not too overly different, but different. You can be a geek without being a nerd, and you can be a nerd without being a geek, but both of them simultaneously work together. For me, geek is someone who's obsessive about a particular fandom, which is another word that's crept up in the last handful of years, to talk about people who get obsessive about things you can get obsessive about. Yes, in the weird sense, you can throw things like sport into this category because people do get obsessive about sports. And it's not like we geeks don't have our own sporting things that we watch. I'm a big person behind Blizzard Entertainment. I love their games. I watch the Overwatch League every year when it comes up and things like that. So I do have my thing. So we geeks do have our sports. There's the Overwatch League. There's now, the PUBG tournaments, the COD tournaments, and things like that people do get obsessive about. And World of Warcraft, StarCraft also have their big followings in some major league sports. I was about to air quote is there, but I can't because it's for these people, it is a major league sport for them. But I digress. So I say I digress. So yeah, that's what the term means for me both. A nerd is someone who's behind a computer working on computer stuff all day. A geek is someone who reads the comic books. And naturally, they both intertwine quite a bit. And there are probably a lot more people who are geeks are nerds as well. Composed probably See, I do these without a script, so you have to understand I do get my tongue tied quite a bit when I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to be saying next. So I can bet you that there are a fair few geeks who are nerds as well. But I doubt very much the other way around. I bet there's a massive amount of nerds who aren't geeks. Now, looking up on dictionary.com, because that was the first thing I could find quickly, and because I do like to back myself up a little bit on this kind of stuff, because, hey, one has to. You can't just say things anymore and just expect to be believed all the time, unless you're a politician, of course, which is something I'm not going to fucking do. So, I looked up both words. I looked up the meaning of geek and the meaning of nerd. Now, the first difference and contrast is nerd only has two different ways it can be used. Geek has at least 5. I'll only mention like the first handful I've found. So, definition of a geek. 1. A digital technology expert or enthusiast, a term of pride as well as self-reference, but often used by others. Blah. Yes, blah is now a word. 2. A person who has excessive enthusiasm for some expertise about a specialized subject or activity. The example they give here is a foreign film geek. Not far off the bullseye, if I like to say so myself. 3. A particular person, especially one who is perceived to be overly intelligent, unfashionable, or socially awkward. That, to me, describes more of a nerd than a geek nowadays, anyways. Albeit 30, 40, 50 years ago? Yeah, the two words are probably one and the same. And 4, this is the best one, a carnival performer who performs sensational, morbid, or disgusting acts as biting off the head of a live chicken. Well, as a self-proclaimed geek, I can reassure you, and not just a self-proclaimed geek, a geek who grew up in Iowa, of all places, I can tell you for sure that I've never bitten the head off a live chicken before. Now, we move over to nerd, however, and as I said, there's only 2 things about this. Nerd. 1. A person considered to be socially awkward, boring, unstylish, etc. I mean, I know several nerds who aren't like that, but essentially, probably, again, back 30, 40, 50 years ago, probably yes. 2, an intelligent but single-minded person obsessed with a non-social hobby or pursuit. The example they give here is one I've already said, a computer nerd. So those are the 2 examples, are the definitions upon dictionary.com. You can look them up yourselves, and there they are. But I'm here to talk about how those 2 particular words have changed over the years in pertaining with how modern society views what is a geek, what is a nerd, and what basically the fandoms are. So, we were established in my very first podcast. There's several different... first episode of this podcast, that there are several different fandoms out there in the world. Saying even several is undermining how many fandoms there are out there. If there is a category people can get interested in, there's going to be a fandom about it. The most notable ones are obviously things like comic book geeks, your sci-fi geeks, your fantasy geeks, and things like that. Those are like probably your 3 major fandoms out there, and you can correlate everything into one of those 3. probably with the exception of anime, but majority of anime came from manga, and manga probably came from some form of comic book beforehand as well. So, there's that. But, as I've said, as the evolution of time, and because we as people do evolve, the terminology of what a geek is to us personally has changed. The dictionary's description may not change over time, or may take you much longer to change. We as humans, as free-thinking individuals, for the most part, see it a bit differently. When I was a kid, and yes, I'm allowed to use that phrase, I'm 30 years old. When I was a kid, things like geek and nerd were used as insults in the classroom. Remember when growing up in America, being called a nerd would be considered an offensive term. Now, I'm not sure if this is a mixture of just growing as an adult and realizing that basically almost everyone's some form of geek or nerd in one way or another, or that society has just realized that's not the case. But the definition of it has changed for me. If I get called a nerd, I will turn around and go, well, what kind of nerd am I? I've given you the example that the dictionary.com has said that computer nerd. Well, I'm not really a computer nerd. I mean, I like dealing with technology. I'm glad technology is around. It makes life easier, but I wouldn't call myself a computer nerd. I'm not someone who, I don't have some 2, 3, 4, 5 grand computer that I've built from scratch, this, that, and the other. Not my kind of thing. I'd like one, but now I'm just splitting hairs. No. And I still think nerd is the wrong term to use for someone like me. So I'm glad we have the term geek. Albeit, apparently, it also means about some circus freak who likes to bite the heads off chickens, apparently. I consider myself a geek, and I probably know several people who would be preferred to be called a geek rather than a nerd. Kind of obvious, kind of understandable, if I'm honest. I wouldn't say that nerd is still an offensive word. Not even in the slightest. But I think the people's terminology of it needs to be rethought. It's an important one to be thinking about, and it's an important one to realize that it is something that needs to be changed. And still, geek. The changing of geek, I don't recall that word being used much when I was young. You guys may recall it being used often when you were young, or you may not. I think that depends on more how socially you grew up. But considering that there are more geeks, and by that I'm not talking about people who bite the head off chickens, out there, then you probably think. I mean, geeks to me sounds like a better word than nerd. A nerd still, for me especially, holds that same stringe of, yeah, you're the unpopular kid in school. Geek doesn't. Everybody's a geek. You geek out. You nerd. I guess you can use the phrase nerd out, but it's not one that's commonly used as far as I can tell, or understanding anyways. You geek out about something. You get your nerd on, you get your geek out. Wonderful little phrases we humans have created. But it's still an interesting topic. So why don't we have a look at what those meanings, or what people who probably fit those meanings, at least in our heads, would understand. So, I know I keep bringing this up, but we're going to set the whole biting the heads off chickens aside, and we're going to just talk about what the word nowadays properly means. Forget any dictionary, Webster's dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary's version of what those words mean, and let's focus on what they are for us. Geek being someone who's obsessive about a fandom. Nerd, someone who's obsessive about intellectual stuff or computers, we'll say, kind of that thing. So we'll mix it into that way. And let's start off in, say, the 1970s. That seems like a good decade to start in. Dungeons and Dragons was just starting to get its way out into the worlds. A lot of sci-fi and things were starting to take off. It must have been a proud moment to be a geek or a nerd. Unless, of course, it was the fact that maybe during that time it probably wasn't a socially accepted thing. Now, I'm not talking about socially accepted stuff like different cultures or things like that. I mean, we're talking about the 1970s. After all, fashion back then, well, I thankfully wasn't around back then, but it's nothing like it is today. Let's put it that way. So, and sure, there's probably a bunch of people went in to see the first Star Wars films because they were like the big sci-fi hit. But how many people back then would have called themselves a geek or a nerd for going to go see those films? Because something like Star Wars, you could be a casual watcher of it. You don't have to dig full-on deep into the lore or the understanding of Star Wars, especially that we have today. Same thing with like Middle-earth, The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings. Excuse me. Both of those books were out by that point, if I'm right. I mean, this is me just kind of guessing on what time things come out. I don't have an exact list of things. Probably should, but I don't. But yeah, so people were probably reading heavily into things like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien. This podcast is going great, by the way, people. Probably watching it more to watch me how many times I make a mistake in this unscripted thing. But yes. But would people like that, who are the casual goers, if you will, consider themselves geeks or nerds back then? I guess the definition of, do you go home and do you play Dungeons and Dragons with other people at the time? Or you get into the first edition of D&D, then a D&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Probably not. Probably, you go see Star Wars. I think it's a pretty cool film. That's it. Probably won't get too deep into the lore or the history. Probably the biggest question at that point is, why did he start with episode 4? But again, this is digressing back into what people probably thought back in the 1970s. So, those terms probably didn't fly around that much, and even if they did, most people probably wouldn't even admit to being one, because they probably didn't know they were one. Let's go to the 1980s now. Move closer. Music starting to hit more of a heavier scene, as I like to say. This is where the time where a lot of the heavy metal music started making more of an appearance. Something I quite like myself. And the term probably changed both terms probably changed quite a bit then as well. If I'm right, all first 3 of the Star Wars films, the original trilogy, were out by then. Yeah. Probably didn't, actually, now thinking about it, probably didn't change that much. Oops. At least is what I think, anyways. That, or more people started realizing maybe they are a bit of a geek. Maybe they are a bit of a nerd. Maybe. Just maybe. I mean, the more often the term gets used, the more often people can probably associate themselves with it, more understanding of what one is. So why don't we skip forward ahead again. 1990s. I was born in 1990. So I have recollection at least of the last 5 years of the 1990s. So 1995 to 2000. And this is like the this is like me. This is my time of growing up and understanding. I lived with my dad in America, just me and him, for the most part, anyways. And I realize now, 20 to 25 years later, that my dad was a massive geek. And not just on any little front. Like, I didn't see the obsessive side of it. And I guess as a kid, you don't see the obsessive side of it because you're worried about what's going on in your own personal life. You're growing up, you're discovering what you might like, what you might not like, and things like that. And parents, brothers, sisters, cousins, and friends always tend to kind of point you in the direction of where these things are going. I didn't realize I was getting heavily into sci-fi at that time. I mean, at the time I actually wasn't that big into sci-fi. My dad's a big Trekkie. He loved Star Trek, and I remember me and my dad going to go see some of the Star Trek films, and I couldn't sit all the way through it. I don't like Star Trek. Sorry to any Trekkies out there, but I don't. It's not part of the thing I like. My dad loves it. I think I remember my dad trying to show me the first Star Wars films and not being that interested. I was more interested in what was going down on Earth, as it were. So, Power Rangers, Pokemon, Digimon, those were the main things I was eagerly into. I didn't realize until I was like in my 20s that things like that, especially Pokemon and Digimon, are fandoms. People obsess majorly over that. And now I do too. I mean, I've got a Dragonite tattoo on my belly, for Pete's sake. But, again, I'm digressing a bit. I'm talking about the 1990s and the Geek and Nerd terminology. If I had to take a point guess, I would have said my dad, if I take like a 7-year-old me and go, would you say your dad's a geek or a nerd? And I would probably say a nerd. My dad worked for computer companies. He was a computer technician for the Air Force. He was a computer guy. He was through and through 100% a computer guy. He was the one who helped. My dad helped me get my first computer, my first laptop, my first Mac, my first MacBook, which I'm recording this episode off of as well. So, and I've always gone to my dad for that. So I see my dad as a computer nerd. That's what he is. And again, it wasn't until later that I realized that my dad was actually a geek. So this is where I tell you these two things kind of intertwine. I could probably tell you that my dad was a geek long before he became a computer nerd. Hell, he'll probably even agree with me on that fact, actually, when he watches this video and then sends me a message like, yeah, you got it spot on, son. And like, I know my dad. Digressing yet again, I get off topic quite easily sometimes, even though I'm still talking about the same topic. Yeah, get back. But, yeah, so I would have seen my dad as a nerd and not a geek at the time. Myself, I probably followed the tendencies of a geek. I had my cartoon shows, or shows that I always had to pick up and watch. I had, with Pokemon, I had thousands of Pokemon cards. And I mean thousands. I had like those old Pokemon binders. I had like at least like two of them full packed kind of thing. Mostly repeats because that's what probably most kids had, like myself, at the time. But I had shitloads of these cards. And I was quite proud of my collection as well. I'm still somewhat proud of it, the fact that I had that many cards. Transformers, I was having to Transformers, which is another fandom that people can get into as well, especially like when you go back to the old 80s cartoons of Transformers. Power Rangers, the original, and probably the first 2, 3, 4 spin-offs that came on afterwards or whatever. And things like that. So yeah, so I would have seen myself as a geek. I had the things I was geeky about. Well, let's now push into the naughties. I hate them being called that so much. It just sounds so wrong for me. But 2000 to 2009, or 2010 if you want to be that level of specific and whatever. Both terms probably didn't change too much around that time, but they were definitely starting to get some more traction, at least in the eye of the public. As more and more things were coming out, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, had been released, and it gave all the Star Wars fans something else to cling on to. Now, there are several Star Wars books out. I'm in the middle of listening to the audiobooks of Darth Bane. And these books were released quite a while ago. I can't say exactly when, but a fair long while ago. So, for 20-something years, probably, Star Wars fans have been reading these books, learning about the wider world of the Star Wars universe, and are finally rewarded with a new film. Just a shame they had to taint it with Jar Jar Binks. But it began. The Star Wars universe began proper. The Lord of the Rings films were coming out around this time as well, which gave every fantasy buff a beginning into. Probably looking around the age, D&D 3rd edition and 3.5 edition were coming out. So, all in all, to be a geek or a nerd, this is probably the best time because everything is just starting. You're at the pinnacle point of seeing these worlds come into full fruition. It was great. It was in those 10 years that I got into Star Wars, that I started realizing that I was a bit of a geek, that I got a lot more into things like fantasy. I didn't get into D&D around that time. As I've said, only last handful of years have I gotten into Dungeons & Dragons. So that doesn't come at least till I'm 28, 27, 28 area. But my way of being a geek had begun. Star Wars, Doctor Who came back on TV during those 10 years. Start off with the actor who I cannot remember, but David Tennant came along, who is my Doctor. Harry Potter, which is another massive fandom, began in that time. The first book I remember came out, I was still in America. Now, I didn't actually leave America until the very end of 2000, but I was still in America when the first book came out. Thus, then the subsequent books, and the films, and now the expanded universe and world of Harry Potter. So, again, another great thing for geeks to start obsessing over. And I did get obsessive with Harry Potter as well. I absolutely enjoyed the books. I enjoyed the films. Much prefer the Fantastical Beast films, because there's a more adult side, and this is what I like about being an adult, is you get to see these things that you had so precious in your childhood come to more of a, there's a more adult side to them all, so you can still enjoy them. There's an adult side to Pokemon. People go back to like the original Pokemon comic strips. Holy crap, they are adult. You actually have, there's like one I saw where an Arbok gets ripped in two. Yeah, it's dark. It's beautiful. So those things started becoming big. It started becoming not so much just like sweep under, have a little spotlight one day a week, sweep under the rug. It's look at this. And then 2008 and the first Iron Man film, kickstarting the MCU. I think that's probably the point when the word and terminology of geek was forever changed. People, for 10 years, the MCU was such a pinnacle point of the cinema industry. It gripped our hearts. And then Marvel went one step further. Because Marvel already had their comics. They had their animated TV shows. Then they had their live action TV shows. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., The Defenders, which include also Iron Fist, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Cloak and Dagger, New Mutants, and things like that, all kicked off the grand start of everything. one that DC is trying quite hard to follow in the trails of. Now, admittedly, they have had a longer live-action series and things kind of going on, if I'm right. But it still doesn't change the fact. And I'm not going to get into my why Superman's the worst superhero ever created argument, because I think I well and truly explained myself on that one. But yes, between 2000 and 2010 were some of the best years for things starting out. It kick-started open, and it basically took what the term geek was, kicked it down, burnt it to the ground, and then rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. And now, at the top of this video, I was explaining to you a bit of what geeks mean by the dictionary term. I don't think that does it justice. I think the best way to describe what a geek is someone who's obsessive about something to the point where they can love and enjoy almost every aspect of it. I'm probably still wrong in that sense, don't get me, in everything. I'm sure I am, actually, because there are certain bits and things I love that I still don't like. But that's the beauty of still being a geek. You can enjoy the things about it that you enjoy. The terminology of nerd probably changed around the same time as well. I mean, to me, I still associate it with someone who's got these computer smarts, or is incredibly intellectual and things like that. But I wouldn't go to a astrophysicist and say you're a nerd. I would say that he's an astrophysicist. I'd call him professor or doctor because he probably has a doctorate. So I wouldn't use the term nerd. Nerd is often used as a slang term. And as I said, when I was a kid, it was used as an offensive term. Unfortunately, not the same way offensive as, say, other words that begin with N, especially for certain people. But when you're a 6-7-year-old kid and you get called nerd on the playground, you can take that pretty harshly back where I grew up, especially with how I grew up. But they changed. 2010, 2020, the last decade we've just been through, saw another massive upheaval of the sense of geek and nerd. Simply because more of the MCU came out. Their live-action shows came out, behind the scenes, and you got to see these great, amazing actors, especially in the MCU, portray such deep, rich characters, come out of it and say that they enjoyed the process. Can we just talk for a moment about how Marvel just seems to pick the right actors for all these roles? Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Chris Evans as Captain America, Samuel Jackson as Nick Fury. They just picked those parts so well. And a little trivia fact as well. So for anyone who's like a big comic book nerd or enough in the Marvel kind of comics to understand, Nick Fury originally was a white man in the comic books. There was in the Ultimate Universe, which has been annoyingly kind of criticized quite a bit. They changed Nick Fury from a white man to a black man. They'd actually had asked Samuel L. Jackson, this is before the MCU, if they could use his likeness for the comic book version of Nick Fury. Which is, again, why Samuel Jackson playing Nick Fury in the MCU was so perfect. Nice little bit of trivia there for anyone who wants to know that one. Absolutely love that fact. But, yeah, the terminology of both changed. And people were more willing to accept that they are geek. Now, inside that with the popularity of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, even YouTube, and Snapchat, the term geek cannot even be seen as an offensive term anymore, if it ever was. we've gotten now to a beautiful and wonderful point of, yeah, actually, a lot of people are happy to say they're a geek. And more importantly, a lot of people will point out the specific kind of geek they are. I don't. I geek out about loads of different freaking things, as I've already said a number of times. The first episode in this podcast, I listed my top 4 things I geek out about. For fuck's sake. But some people will be specific. They'll have like one thing they geek out more over than anything else, and that's what they'll refer to it as. I know several people who are major Star Wars geeks. They love everything about Star Wars. They dig in and find any new information. Things like that. I know people who are massive, like, Middle Earth geeks. And they dig in. You can find all these people on YouTube. This is what I mean by YouTube being more of a social media platform. Well, yes, it's primarily videos. People do these videos in a social media format. I've spent the last couple of months during lockdown looking up different information on the expanded Star Wars universe and the expanded Middle Earth universe as well, about all the stories and things behind that. Because they're things I get obsessive about. I want to know this stuff. And yes, while I know I could sit down and read these books, we ain't all got time to sit and read books. But now we've come to the present time. We're in the 20s again. The 2020s. And while, yes, we are plague-ridden at the minute, and hopefully not for much longer, fingers crossed and knock on wood, hopefully they're going to change again. Probably not as big this time, but they are liable to change again, which is fine. Nothing wrong with change. There never will be. But what do you think they might change to this time? More and more things on both Star Wars and comic book stuff are coming out consistently. D&D is now more popular than it's ever been. Hell, I mean, if you go back and listen to certain celebrities who talk about it, or even just like other people who've been in the D&D game for a long time, they talk about the difference of back when they were kids playing D&D, they would even cover the table with a cloth when they had pizza delivered because they didn't want the pizza guy to know they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. To nowadays, so many people post their D&D games out as podcasts or as videos and things like that. We're not afraid to hide that fact anymore. There are so many people out there now who openly admit they love all these things of Star Wars and know so much of the history behind it. Same with Middle Earth. Pokemon, there are people my age and older who obsess with Pokemon, which was, when it first came to America, and probably England as well, it was a kid's TV show and a kid's game. If you want to kind of sit and believe that the terminology of what a geek is hasn't changed over time, I've given you just enough evidence in the last 2 minutes that should be more than viable. As for the term nerd, I think it's time we change the definition, or add to it. We need to get rid of this sense of unfashionable or socially awkward. Social awkwardness and social anxiety is probably embedded in more people than you realize. So you can't add social awkwardness to a description like that anymore. And fashionable, I mean, I don't watch the red carpet kind of stuff. It's not my thing. But I've seen some stuff of it. And if that's fashion, I don't want anything to do with it anyways. I'm quite happy with a pair of black jeans, some top that has some awesome geek logo on it, or some metal band on it. That's my kind of fashion. You can't depict fashion for everybody when it doesn't apply to everybody. And plus, cosplayers are fucking awesome. If you got enough patience to dedicate that much time to creating something in that kind of way, you deserve something more than just a bunch of photos at a Comic-Con. And probably a couple 100,000 likes on Facebook. In my opinion. But I think nerd needs to have a update on what it actually means. Still kind of put in the fact that it talks about someone who's intellectual and the best known as like computer nerds, but it needs to be something more. And Geek probably could do with a bit of an update as well. You know, I'd like to hear what you guys think about this. I really would. I think it'd be great, make a great thing for you guys to talk about. So, I leave these questions with you on another short video, unfortunately. I'm going to have to definitely start wrangling some of the other crit takers into these videos as well, just to kind of get their opinions and have someone to talk to, so it's not just me rambling on for 40 minutes or half an hour or however long, or an hour or whatever. But yes, so my questions to you this week, guys. What is your term or version or understanding of what a geek and a nerd is? Something like that. And what do you think we can add to both of them that make it a bit easier to understand and define them? I think that's going to be an interesting topic, interesting discussion. I think so anyways. So, I think that's where I'll probably leave this week off. Like I said, I don't write scripts for these podcasts or anything like that. I just kind of ramble on for a little bit. Pick a topic, and off I go. But I do want to thank everyone for all of you for watching this video. Please, 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 please do not forget to like and subscribe to the Crit Takers YouTube channel. Please do not forget to go to A Day in the Tavern and Crit Takers on Facebook and Instagram, because both of us have pages on Instagram as well. Give them a like to follow up. And I do post questions each week, give or take, about things I might be talking about on this podcast. So if you like to have your answers read out or add to the discussion of what is, please follow them and please comment on these posts, okay? Please like, please subscribe, hit the bell for any notifications, and hopefully, Crit Takers, that we'll be back, hopefully in May. I really hope in May. With some live stream episodes for you all guys to pick up the campaign where we left off last year. Please, until then, keep well, stay safe, you are important, and keep drinking. See ya.